In 1930, the Republican-controlled House of Representatives, in an effort to alleviate the effects of the, anyone? The Great Depression, passed the, anyone? The tariff bill, the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, which, anyone, raised or lowered? Raised tariffs in an effort to collect more revenue for the federal government. Did it work? Anyone know the effects? It did not work, and the United States sank deeper into the Great Depression. Today, we have a similar debate over this. Anyone know what this is, class? Anyone seen this before? The Laffer curve. Anyone know what this says? It says that at this point on the revenue curve, you will get exactly the same amount of revenue as at this point. This is very controversial. Does anyone know what Vice President Bush called this in 1980? Anyone? Something DOO economics. Voodoo economics.
Anyone know know which film this is? Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Well done. And maybe we'll sort of touch upon the fact that I think school has been a staple site for cinema for very many years. Sorry for the slightly late start, but obviously we wanted you all to make your way over here and settle in and make sure the room is full, and that's what's happened, and that's wonderful. My name is Shumon, I'm the Commissioner of the Global Art Forum. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the 13th edition. School is a Factory. It's been programmed by myself and my co-directors Victoria Camblin, executive editor at 032C magazine in Berlin, and Fawz Kabra, an independent curator and writer based in New York. I'm deeply grateful to both of them for their insights and their intelligence and everything that they've brought to this incredible program over the next 2 days. You'll meet them both in a little bit more detail in a few minutes' time. Before I go any further, though, we thought it was not only appropriate but also very important to take a moment to mention the premature passing of two former Global Art Forum guests, B.C. Silva and Okwi Enwezor. In 2013, B.C. spoke about her hometown, Lagos, where she established the Center for Contemporary Art, and Okwi joined us just a year later, reflecting on his experience as the first non-European and first African director of Documenta in 2002. They were both instrumental in reframing how the world must understand itself from multiple centers, be it Africa, be it post-colonial history, or indeed the sheer poetry of the human spirit. Bisi and Okwi will be dearly missed, but also very, very remembered for a very, very, very long time. If I could ask you, please, just to switch your phones to silent at this point. If you're going to be posting, which we hope you are, the hashtag we're using is GAF13 and at Art Dubai. The Global Art Forum, of course, is a large collective effort, and I just have to thank a number of very, very important people that made all of this possible. Our forum team, Benny, Fatima, Judel, as ever, you've been amazing. I want a round of applause for those three people in particular. Thank you. Everybody at our dear colleagues at Art Dubai, Ben, Pablo, Chloe, Wakas, Kira, Leo, Neha, and Leila, to all our volunteers for their hard work and invaluable help. To everybody at the back, Abil, Previn, and Azim, the AV crew, and to the UAE Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation for their continued and meaningful support of the forum. Another round of applause for everybody. Thank you very much. So I just want to do a very, very short, brief introduction for those of you who perhaps have not been to the Global Art Forum before. I thought it's important to share with you what we have been doing and what we'll be doing for the next 2 days. In a sense, we take a kind of cultural temperature of our current moment in time. We do this by thinking globally in concentric circles of connection that start from where we are here in Dubai and the UAE and in the Gulf, And we also do this horizontally across disciplines of knowledge and history. To date, we've invited 500 of the world's most compelling minds to think out loud, and previous editions of the forum have dealt with media, language, historiography, technology, the future, trade, and automation. In a way, we think of it as a continuous conversation which ricochets back and forth, high and lowbrow, obvious to obscure. So last year, the forum was entitled I Am Not a Robot, and over the course of installments staged in London, Dubai, and Singapore, we measured the ways in which automation affects our real and imagined lives. I want to mention two examples of things that we touched on during I Am Not a Robot. Firstly, there was, of course, the question of how much current human labor will be further automated in the coming decades. If so, what kinds of education and purpose will humans require to remain future-proof? And then there was the phrase that obviously kept coming around, and I'm sure you've also heard of it many, many times, and that phrase is machine learning, which is the computational technology behind our dominant form of so-called artificial intelligence. But who is doing the teaching in machine learning? And are we, as a species, even qualified to teach machines? Every day you wake up and the world has changed yet again. You're constantly playing catch-up. Where do you go to educate yourselves against this torrent of new daily ignorance? Do you go to Wikipedia? Do you watch a TED Talk during your lunch break? Do you go to Reddit? Or might you even go to the comment section of a bulletin board run by a 15-year-old boy in Savannah, which many people do actually today, particularly 15-year-old boys, not only from Savannah, but all around the world. So education is happening to us whether we are in school or not, because the powerful forces of miseducation are shaping us all the time. Question, what's the difference between information, knowledge, and wisdom? And when did edutainment, which is that awkward portmanteau of education and entertainment, become so very popular? It's worth reminding ourselves that I think TED Talks have been watched at least 2 billion times. And that's an interesting thing to think about. So these questions became the starting point of the 13th global edition of the 13th edition of the Global Art Forum. To tell you more about how we've approached the theme and why, will you please welcome co-director number 1, Victoria Camblin. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shumon. And thanks again to all of our colleagues at Art Dubai and the Global Art Forum and my wonderful co-organizer, Fawz and Shumon. The title of this conference refers to an artwork by Akula called School is a Factory, sans question mark. And Akula used to give evening photography classes at a community college in the late 1970s. And apparently his students very rarely wound up with a job in photography as a result of this training. So the work, which is from this time, is based on these experiences and is a critique of the educational system, specifically the American capitalist one, in which school has a normative function, formatting students to accept and reproduce certain social conditions. Instead of endowing students with social mobility, in other words, Akula's scholastic factory not only perpetuates the hierarchies and segregations of that the American dream promised a way out of, but it does so under the false pretense of doing the opposite, of liberating its participants. A structure from which, of course, those already in charge prosper more, and others become even more ingrained in their particular position, having spent all that time and money on community college, or as the case may be, in our sphere, on an expensive MFA. It's something of another Hollywood cliche in high school films for the commencement speech to begin with a definition or kind of an Aristotle quote or something where the terms are subverted by the speaker. So I'm going to reproduce that cliche here, looking at the terms from the title of this year's GAF, and of course the question mark we've added to the assertion. So I was interested to know that in its Greek and Latin origin, I'm sorry, it's almost unbearable to do this cliche. And I was surprised to learn that in its Greek and Roman, its Greek and Latin origins, school refers to a place of leisure, where you would go perhaps for learned discussion. So it was not some kind of work-oriented formation, but a place that occupied your spare time, which sets up a class distinction right from the get. And of course, speaking of class, we use this word all the time in an educational context, and we think of it as a designation of peership or camaraderie, but of course it's a ranking. Originally a military one, or something that was used for the purposes of taxation. And as things evolve through the early modern period, it of course begins to refer to a division of social status, so upper and lower class. And then in the industrial age, it becomes much more concretely no longer a group of individuals or things that have something in common, but it actually starts to mean something of high quality. So to have class is to be of some kind of upper echelon. So we have this really basic connection with the most essential words we use around education in English, anyway, that has to do with, that links conventional educational models to a language of wealth and social status, and consequently to accessibility, and unfortunately to exclusivity. And Akula was probably aware of this connotation when he paired the word school with factory, which we, of course, initially might find surprising. And of course, the educated class wants nothing to do with a factory unless, of course, they own one in this industrial period. But interestingly, factory also comes in its origins from the verb for doing and making. So there is a very sort of nice agency there in its origins. A productive agency, which of course we distance ourselves from as we industrialize various forms of production and create a divide between sort of the human and all the rest. And if I'm emphasizing the Industrial Revolutionary period, bear with me. It's also a time that we see a lot of educational change, and really it's when the modern university as we know it crystallizes, and also primary education becomes more widespread, people become more literate, secondary education becomes accessible, and these European models also start to proliferate in Imperial England, France, and so on. In fact, the European system almost takes on a missionary quality at this time as well. And the comparison is this, is that I think we can all agree that we're in a moment of accelerated technological development now. So if there's anything to be learned from that particular industrial history and its impact on education as we've come to know it, not just in the West, but frankly, in this globalized sense, it's a nice sign, perhaps, that we should be looking at the consequences of our digital or post-digital age. Overall, we have themes of class and capital, agency, social mobility or lack thereof, industry, work and production models, and of course the role of education in models of colonialization and in globalization. And as we navigate through this, we'll also touch on questions of environment, so of educational models that have developed and are developing in response to climate change, crisis zones, global migration. There's a shady undercurrent of violence to the framework that I pointed out in Akula's title, the military legacy of our modern institutions. There's also an aspect of freedom, empowerment, accessibility, experimentation, shared research, and a shared desire for progress. We'll come to the question of art and art education, their function of as products of and potentially as antidotes to existing educational models. And then we'll also be confronting the very notion of the institution. So its alternatives in grassroots and interdisciplinary and experimental forms of learning, and to those alternatives' capacity sometimes to mimic the very frameworks they're seeking to escape, and at other times to reveal their shortcoming. So it's obviously quite a big remit I've cast. It's a hard assignment to go back to that high school vocabulary. And I think that the question mark adds to that. It serves to ask how far we've come, where we're going, and indeed to use another Hollywood cliche of like a college counselor or concerned middle-class parent is what we want to do with ourselves going forward in this next period. With our futures as far as education is concerned, and are we giving it enough thought and intention? So one last thing that we remarked on just very consistently as we developed this program was how unique this topic was in terms of its relatability, and how personally it seems to apply, and how passionately it's addressed by everyone in the room at a given time. We all have an experience of one kind of education or another. Some of you are raising families, considering your children's educational paths. Many of you are educators. All of you had some kind of teacher. I think it's safe to say that you remember, whether it's for their capacity to instill fear or to inspire. And of course, everyone here has learned some type of computer program and has probably been taught something by one as well. So it's our hope that within the universality of this topic, we can still get at its action as a barometer for all the social, political, technological, and creative conditions we're dealing with collectively today. And hopefully our research that we come up with in this period will find other ways to subvert and reframe the terms in our title and in our individual titles. So with all of that in mind, it's with great enthusiasm and gratitude that I turn over the mic to Fawz, my co-director, who will give you a preview of our day today.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Shumon and Victoria, Global Art Forum, Art Dubai. It's really wonderful to be here. I'll just take you through our program for the day. I think most of us have been taught at one point or the other that there's no such thing as a stupid question. After all, asking questions is something that is learned. So I encourage you to notice how this forum is full of questions, starting with our title, School is a Factory, which Victoria defined so well. For day one, we wanted to go back to the not-so-distant past, 100 years ago, with the start of the Bauhaus. Here today, we review this movement critically through the work of Grant Wilson, Marion Schmidt von Osten, and their international collaborators who have shed light on the Bauhaus's influence. We ask, how can we understand the legacy of the Bauhaus in light of the changing world of geopolitics? Maud Usay continues this inquiry with a discussion with Grant Wilson and Victoria on the Bauhaus's non-European strands from India to Morocco and beyond. Approaching nearer to the present, we're going to turn to the 90s with the work of Barbara van der Linden and her lecture, What is Laboratorium?, where she reflects on the laboratory and experimentation as tools to facilitate artistic and scientific research. Can art and science work together to progress a public dialogue? And this will be followed by a conversation with Barbara and Fernanda Brenner on the ideal conditions for sharing research findings. Victoria Ivanova's video lecture, titled School is a Laboratory, R&D at the Institution, echoes the work of Barbara van der Linden by bringing us to the present moment. How are art institutions responding to today's accelerated technology? How are art institutions using pedagogical models to innovate, and what can we learn from historical and contemporary interactions of art and technology in the field? We will then move through to the current moment and talk with Antonia Carver and Elvira Diangani Ose, who join Shumon in a discussion about education through their work in the space of the art establishment. Art and culture centers, museums, biennales. Finally, we'll wrap up the day with dear dad Dol Qadr, who responds to our prompt with his lecture, Schools and Factories. I urge you to think about class, accessibility, and privilege throughout as we listen to the talks ahead. Just as education naturally follows the progression of our economic, social, and techno-industrial systems, we're reaching a period where we have the most enrolled students. My son was on a waiting list for daycare, for example. And the most uncertain workforce future as well. Possibly a risky future because technology and automation have already begun making middle-level skill work redundant, like all regular jobs, such as checking into the doctor's office, for example. Could that kind of skill work return to be something we do, but not for money, but for joy and relaxation, kind of like work tourism? I will leave you with that, but I'd like to give the floor to Victoria, who will now introduce the first talk of the day. Thank you all.
Thank you.